So we have the if statement. One thing we can also do is we can also add in the else statement. So let's take a look at this. We have an else and we can add in a bracket here. So we'll say if some bool is equal to true, we'll say some string is equal to else. We'll say some string is equal to, well, let's just say else for the moment. All right, so let's set bool to false here, and you can see that, this whole if statement doesn't even get run. So remember, the compiler reads everything line by line. So we go some bool is equal to true, and if this statement is not true, like if it's false here, some bool, is equal to true. But if this is false, then it'll simply go to the else. All right, and this works out pretty well. Now, when do we use else statements? Oftentimes, if we were to just use this example here, this would probably be not as good as what I'm about to show you. Generally, the else is used for any other kind of random situation that you haven't thought of. If you have something that's a lot more specific, you need to use something called an else if. So let's take a look at that, else if. Now an else if works exactly the same way an if statement does, but it only comes in if the if statement is not true. So we'll say some bool is double equal to true. Okay. Add in the curly brackets. They all need the curly brackets here. And we'll say some string is double equal to, or equal to, we'll say else if. All right, and you can see, you can look at that here. And we'll actually make this false because that's exactly what we want. So if some bool is not equal to true, this else if, you can see that it works here. So if the if statement's not true, it goes to the else. And if the else if statement is not true, then it goes completely to the else. Now, let's change this to score. So we'll say score is equal to, let's say score is greater than or equal to 10. Okay, and then we'll say here score is greater than or equal to 20, and we'll say else, something like that here. And of course we need to add in that there. So we'll say if score is greater than equal to 10, then it will show the if here. Now watch what happens when I put in like 30. Okay, now this is a good example of having your logic not make any sense. Because what we wanted to have here is like, if your score is between 10 and 20, then, you can see that technically anything greater than 10, this if statement is going to run. So what you have to do is you have to add in the and. We'll say score is less than or equal to 20. Okay. And that way, you can see that, and of course you have to use the less than sign. But you can see here that, if it's in a range, and this is very common with if statements, and specifically with numbers, you have a range, all right? And it's always good to be specific. So we'll say score is less than or equal to, let's say 40, all right? And then we go to the else if. And then if we put in something like, 50, right? You can see that the else statement gets in there. So again, the else is there just in case you have something that's not supposed to be there. It's there for error handling. And that's the way you should use it. Every time you have something specific, you should be using an else if. Now, how many else ifs can you have? Well, let me just copy and paste this else if here. And let's make this maybe something like 50 and 60. And then we could add in another else if here. And we can make this something like 70 and 80. And you can see here that we have an if and 3 else ifs and an else. So let's take a look at what an if statement is. So this is your entire if statement, okay? And every if statement has one if and one else, but it can have an unlimited amount of else ifs, okay? So if, else ifs, and then just the simply else here. Now you can have multiple if statements, right? We can add in another one here. We can say if score is less than or equal to 0, etc. We can copy this down again and again. We can let's say is less than or equal to -4, something like -70, etc. So you can have as many ifs as you want here, but you can only have one else per if, right? So you can't just have, let's say if I were to copy this for example, and I were to type and paste it again, it'll probably come up with some kind of error, right? In fact, it says implicitly disregard this closure. Again, all it's saying there is that you can't have two else statements, but you can have unlimited else if statements as well. So let's just add in an else if, and we'll say score is, not equal to 9 or something like that. Doesn't really matter here, but it's possible to not even have an else statement. You can have that if you want. So we're going to be looking at, and as you go through this course, you'll be using if statements in practical applications here, but this is just the basic explanation of this. All right, so that's what an if statement is, and you want to treat an if statement just like a sports move. You've learned what if statements are, but now you have to use them in very specific ways. All right, this concludes the tutorial.